The Nintendo Game Boy and I have had a very, very long history together. Ever since I was small, the Game Boy has been my very first console. The first console is actually mine. Later, I got an N64, which would become my first kind of home console, but the Game Boy was always mine. We had an NES growing up, we had an SNES later, but they were kind of the families. The SNES was later my brother's, but the Game Boy was my very first console that belonged to me, that was mine, that I had to take care of and stuff like that. So basically this has been a passion that has run through my entire life, and in 2024 now there are so many cool and unique and like interesting ways that you can play the Game Boy out with just picking up the old school DMG, plugging in some batteries, plugging in a game and getting to going. So in this video I'm going to show you some of the cool ways you can play Game Boy in 2024, and as well as a couple of cool wee kind of sneaky mods that you can do to your Game Boy, as well as maybe some of your other consoles to play the Game Boy in 2024. But before we get started guys, please think about liking, subscribing, commenting, all that good stuff, and let's play some Game Boy. So the first one I'm obviously going to talk about is the original, is the OG Game Boy, the DMG. This one here, this is actually a modded Game Boy video that James and I done a long time ago to see who could build the best Game Boy. Now, a funny story about this is the fact that I ended up having to use my original Game Boy, because the Game Boy that I bought for the project, the board was actually Goose, so I did end up having to use my old school Game Boy, but to be fair, the screen and kind of bits were gone, so it wasn't kind of need an upgrade. We done this kind of wee competition to kind of see who could build the best modern Game Boy. And in this here, you can see there's a backlit screen. I've done a USB-C battery mod and stuff like that. But the original DMG, the old school grey one, is the DMG. It is the Game Boy to me. It's funny because like it became that thing where everybody referred to anything gaming as a Game Boy back in the day. So like it could be a PlayStation, and like parents would always refer to it as like a Game Boy. Later on down the line, I got the Game Boy Pocket. This one I've got here is actually my original Game Boy Pocket. I remember one fantastic Christmas where I asked for a Game Boy Pocket. I got the Game Boy camera, I got loads of games and just loads of cool stuff. The Game Boy Pocket is just a smaller form factor. The screen's a wee bit brighter, 2 AA batteries, and I think it's nicer in the hands, it's small and stuff like that. So later on came the Game Boy Color. Again, this is a modded one here. I just upgraded the screen on this. The Game Boy Color, I kind of overlooked it a wee bit because by this point I think I'd had the N64 for a while, so the Game Boy was kind of on the back burner for me at this stage, and I wasn't really fussed. It was basic stuff, and when it was released it never had a backlit screen, so that was a big detractor for me. It wasn't until maybe the Game Boy Advance came out that I started getting back into handheld Game Boy gaming again. Game Boy Advance games were just next level. There was a massive upgrade between Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance in my opinion. Game Boy, like DMG, Pocket, Game Boy Color, they all kind of had the same looking games. It wasn't until Game Boy Advance then that I really got back into it. And a good thing about the Game Boy Advance is you can play the Game Boy games on it. Later on after that was the DS. Now I've not got the original DS, I've got my DS Lite here, but unfortunately this can only play Game Boy Advance games, not original Game Boy games, but there is a mod that we can do to put Game Boy games onto this, which I will show you in a wee while. Now, so when it comes to consoles, the SNES had the Super Game Boy. Now, I absolutely loved this thing because some of the Game Boy games that you got had like inbuilt special features where if you put it in, it would have like a unique border and it would just look cool. Some of them would change into like an arcade machine looking thing, and it would make the colours look a lot better. Like it would add colours to the Game Boy games, and it made it feel like it was a new game. Playing it on a big screen back then was absolutely mind blowing. The N64 never got an official Game Boy player, but we'll get to that in a second. It was the GameCube then that got the Game Boy player at the bottom. This is such a cool accessory. The only pain in the balls is the fact that you need the boot up disc. Now I have the boot up disc, but you come across Game Boy players in the wild so often, but so many are missing the discs. So there's another thing I'll show you in a wee while, sorry now, where you can basically use the Game Boy player without the Game Boy startup disc, which is super handy. But the Game Boy player had loads of cool wee features, upscaling features and stuff like that, that again kind of made the old school Game Boy games seem a lot, it refreshed them, it made them feel new again, and again playing them on a big screen. By this point the screens or TVs were bigger and more beautiful. I think by this point, the Game Boy on the Game Boy on the GameCube, there we go, it really, really worked. And again, you could play the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, all across the board here. Now, so when it comes to the N64, there's a couple of cool things here. So we never got an official Game Boy player on the N64, but there is this thing called the Game Boy Hunter. Now, this has been kind of hit or miss for me. You do need an N64 game to plug into the back. There is this absolutely infuriating music that seems to play over every game. So it doesn't play the Game Boy game music. It plays this absolutely obnoxious, bloody repeating, just nails on a chalkboard music. But again, you get to play Game Boy on the N64, which there 100% should have been an official one, but there wasn't. So Nintendo, please enlighten me. I would love to know why you never released one. So in another video, I've done the Summer Kart 64 here. Now there is a way you can take your Game Boy backups and basically convert them into a N64 emulation file, and you can put those then onto the Summer Kart. Again, this has been kind of hit or miss for me. It's worked with some, it's not worked with others, it's kind of crashed. But then it's another way you can play Game Boy on the N64. After that though, this is something I've covered that I absolutely love, and again, it should have been a feature that they built in properly, is using the transfer pack to play Game Boy games through an app or through a modded game called Transfer Boy. It's a cool proof of concept that it can work, but again, it's been very, very hit or miss for me. You plug in the Game Boy game into the transfer pack into the back of the N64 controller, you boot up the Transfer Boy game, we'll just call it, and then it basically reads the game through the transfer pack, through the data line of the controller, into the N64, and it works. Again, it's been hit or miss. It's infuriating because it's such a good proof of concept. I just wish they would work on it a wee bit more. But it's a start, and it's cool, and it's unique, and I absolutely love it. So those are the home consoles that you can use to play official hardware Game Boy games. I love these, absolutely fantastic. But in this day and age now, you're not going to be rocking around with loads of Game Boy games, a GameCube to plug into a TV somewhere. And the whole point of the Game Boy was the fact that it was portable, that you could put it into your bag and just go. Like when you're on the bus, you can play it. I played it on the plane over to Portland last year. There's just loads of cool ways to do it. But one thing I feel like I really need to talk about is emulation and in the current state of handheld gaming, especially when it comes to emulating these kinds of games. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the Mii U Mini. So I did pick this up last year in Portland at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo in 2023. Overall, I'm kind of mixed with this. It's cool. It's a cool handheld. I do like it. It's very powerful. I am just not overly sold on it, because if I am going to play a handheld, I would almost pick the 3DS or the PS Vita over this. I don't know why. It's just personal preference. It's cool. I'm not saying it's hard for me to make sense of it. It's cool. There's just something about it. I didn't think it's worth. I think it was the hype behind it. Everybody was saying it was fantastic. It was amazing. Then when I eventually got my hands on it, I wasn't overly fussed about it. But again, this is the Mii U Mini video. This is Game Boy video. So you can play Game Boy games on this. You can play a load of things on the Mii U Mini. But Game Boy can obviously be emulated on this. It gives you the portability. It's got good battery life. It's got a good screen. It's got all the buttons that you need, obviously, because the Game Boy only had what, like 4 buttons and a D-pad. So look, it is what it is. The Mii U Mini, handy. If you like it, use it. The PS Vita, like I said, there's the PSP, the 3DS, all these can be modded in themselves to emulate Game Boy games rather easily as well. Like there's nothing really difficult. Well, I'm not a programmer. You know, these seem to be like easy games to emulate that didn't really cause any issues with modern hardware. The two kind of big ones that I want to talk about is the Steam Deck and the Switch. Now obviously the Switch makes sense being a Nintendo console. Over the course of the last couple of years, they've released Game Boy games on their online library, which has been amazing. The Steam Deck kind of falls in the same line as the Mii U Mini, where, you know, you just load up an emulator, load in your ROMs, and then you're pretty much good to go. So for the DMG to the Switch, Game Boy has pretty much been covered in every step. The NES didn't have Game Boy support, the N64 didn't have Game Boy support, the PlayStation had a Game Boy Hunter style peripheral where you could run Game Boy games on it. I think it might even be called the Game Boy Hunter on it. I'm not sure. I'll put it here if I find it. But it's weird the N64 never did. I cannot get over it. I'm going to make a separate video about that, maybe. I don't know. There's a couple of things that I've done in the modern era now where I've actually made my own Game Boy console. So this is the Game Boy Consolizer mod, basically taking the board of the original Game Boy. You connect basically, long story short, a HDMI output to it, a Bluetooth receiver to it, and then you can connect your controller to the Game Boy console and then play it. This is one of the best ways to play Game Boy, especially the original carts that I've found, and I really love it. It was a fairly complicated project for me. It was just a lot of kind of wiring, and just it's not a beginner build by any means, but it's super handy. Last but not least, there was the Game Boy Interceptor. Now this was a video that I'd done recently enough, so this lets you stream your Game Boy footage through your Game Boy onto your PC via the USB-C. So this is a super handy wee thing. Again, this just plugs into the Game Boy. My Game Boy's not here. Of course, I've not got my Game Boy when I'm talking about Game Boy, but you basically plug this in to your Game Boy, plug the game in, make sure it's facing you like that even, and then that just goes into the Game Boy. Plug in the USB-C, turn on your capture software, and it recognizes it as a webcam, and that's it. Again, it doesn't capture the music, but it captures the gameplay, and it's a toss-up for me now actually between this and the Game Boy Consolizer, because the Consolizer's cool, it can be plugged into the TV through there, big screen playing Game Boy games, which is amazing, but using the actual Game Boy to play the game while it's being captured on a big screen is really cool. So there's a lot of ways now in 2024 the Game Boy can be played, either through original hardware, peripherals, third-party peripherals, mods, emulation, random builds, Raspberry Pis, all this good stuff. So I'm going to start rambling now because I could legit talk about this all day, and my throat's actually starting to get a bit sore.
That's what she said.
Please let me know down below, what is your favourite way to play Game Boy in 2024? I would love to know. There's obviously things like the Wii, the Wii U, there's loads that I've not covered. So if you feel like there's anything I've missed that you think I should talk about, please let me know down below. I think that's it. Guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next one. Bye for now.